Hey, I'm Scott, and I'm an American in Bangkok. Sawadee Cup, วันนี้เป็นครบรอบปีเหตุการณ์6ตุลา which basically translates into today is the anniversary of the October 6th massacre, or depending on the perspective being taken, the October 6th event. And the event that I'm referring to is the Thammasat University shooting, which took place October 6, 1976, 45 years ago at Thammasat University, and also across from the university at Sanam Luang. In 1976, students and workers and others were taking part in ongoing demonstrations, and the Thai police, paramilitary, attacked the students, and 46 people from both sides ended up being killed. These are official reports. 167 were wounded. Unofficial reports were that more than 100 people had been killed. And these people protesting were protesting the return of the prime minister from 1963 to 1973, Tanom Kittikachorn. He's the prime minister and military dictator. But let me give you a little bit of context here. It's quite interesting what occurred. Back in 1930, Thailand was still overwhelmingly a country of peasant farmers. The military was its best organized, most cohesive modern institution, and their crucial role in the 1932 revolution was underscored in October 1933 when pro-royalists protesters marched on Bangkok. They were repulsed by troops commanded by Lieutenant Colonel P. Boon Songkram. The following year, P. Boon became defense minister. In 1938, when he headed a cabinet of predominantly military men, P. Boon and his supporters, unimpressed by the floundering Western democracies of the period, were attracted to other political models, fascist Italy, Germany, and above all, Japan. The era from 1948 through 1973 is known as the strongman era. P. Boon, as I said, was the prime minister. He is the person who changed the country's name from Siam to Thailand in 1939, although Siam was briefly used again from 1945 to 1949. November 1940, when Thai forces invaded Laos and western Cambodia, the Japanese, who now held base and transit rights in French Indochina, stepped in to mediate, awarding Cambodia's western provinces and portions of Laos to Thailand. This victory was popular in Thailand, and P. Boon's subsequent relationship with the Japanese would become more controversial, though. In December 1941, the Japanese moved troops into Thailand, demanding transit rights for their attacks on British Burma and Malay. Thai troops resisted, but within hours, the P. Boon government called for a ceasefire. And they then entered a military alliance with Japan, and in January 1942 declared a war on the United States and Britain. P. Boon's actions were widely supported, and Thailand was rewarded by Japan with the Shan states of Burma in 1942 and the 4 northern Malay states in 1943. Disillusionment began to set in as the tide of war turned against Japan, and Thailand experienced acute economic disruption because of the war. In July 1944, P. Boon quietly resigned the prime ministership, leaving the National Assembly with the problem of preparing Thailand for an Allied victory. At the time, in 1946, Priti Panomyong, who I discussed a few weeks ago when I walked down Priti Panomyong, the street, which is Sukhumvit Soi 71, he was viewed by conservatives as a radical leftist and resigned amidst mounting hysteria against communists. The government continued to flounder until the military stepped in with a coup in November 1947. Initially, they retained a civilian prime minister but forced him to resign in April 1948. He was replaced by Pibun, who started the strongman era. The resumption of military dominance over government instigated a succession of authoritarian leaders who were unchallenged by forces outside the military until 1973. This power was enhanced by U.S. patronage and aid. Washington wanted strong anti-communist leaders who would both repress domestic communism and join in American-led strategies for the containment of Asian communism. Back then, communism was greatly feared, and obviously there was the Cold War going on, and if you were deemed a communist in America, that was the end for you. Your name was mud. From the 1950s, U.S. aid to Thailand was substantial. It enabled a great deal of social and economic development, notably in communications infrastructure and social welfare projects. But it also bolstered military and police power. After 1948, Pibun resumed many of his former repressive policies and mounted another anti-Chinese campaign, and also attempted to impose cultural uniformity forcibly on the Malay Muslims of the far south. The latter resisted the arrival of Thai officials, the introduction of Thai language education, and the substitution of Thai law for customary law. A separatist movement grew, which, despite conciliation by later Thai governments, persists to this day. Despite Pibun's tough image, his power was not, in fact, secure. He faced several attempted coups within the military between 1948 and 1951. All were defeated, but at the price of the emergence of two further strongmen, Army Commander, subsequently Field Marshal Sarit Thanarat, whose later spectacular wealth would be grounded in his control of the government lottery, and Police Chief Pao Sianon, who would make his fortune from opium trafficking. That's right, the police chief. In 1955, Pibun eased the controls on political activity and promised elections. He may have been under American pressure to do so, or may have hoped to outmaneuver his rivals by winning popular endorsement. However, his party was accused of massive fraud during the 1957 election, and Sarit won popularity by resigning, supposedly in disgust, from Pibun's government. In September 1957, Sarit staged a coup, driving Pibun and Pao into exile. When Sarit died in December 1963, power was transferred peaceably to his close associates, General Thanachon Kittikachorn, who became Prime Minister, and Prapas Charusatian, who was the Deputy Prime Minister. During this time, the military's place in the Thai political landscape seemed to loom larger than ever. U.S. aid increased sharply because of the Indochina conflicts. From 1964, Thailand provided bases for the U.S. Air Force and committed its own troops to action in Vietnam and Laos. U.S. aid was also forthcoming to combat a communist insurgency which had taken root amongst alienated tribal groups in the country's north and northeast. The era of unquestioned strongman rule was drawing to a close, however. Economic development, wider education, and better communications were rapidly increasing the numbers of the politically aware. In 1968, Thanom proclaimed a new constitution, and an election the following year established a new parliament. The political public was shocked when he reversed direction in 1971, dissolving the parliament and banning political parties once more. By the early 70s, several other issues were raising concern. The leader's presumed successor, Narong Kittikachorn, his son, and Prapas's son-in-law, was not highly regarded inside or outside the military. Thailand's close involvement with the United States obviously required rethinking as the U.S. moved to disengage from Vietnam and the region. The OPEC oil shock and rising prices sent tremors through the economy. It was the educated young who precipitated the downfall of the Phnom Propus regime in October 1973. Student protests against political repression, inspired to some extent by the Western student radicalism of the era, escalated into massive confrontation with the police on the streets of Bangkok. Popular sympathy for the students increased when several of their number were killed or wounded by the police. The demonstrators triumphed when the army withheld its support from the prime minister and his regime, who then fled into exile. So he went into exile in 1973, and then in 1976, when he decided to come back, the students and many others took part in these demonstrations to protest his return, even though he stated he would not become involved in politics again, which he never did. So today, on this day, 45 years ago, 46 people, or more than 100 people, were killed and 167 were wounded. Depending on who you believe, or depending on whose account is correct. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. If you like this bit of information, please leave a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I will see you again. The next time I'm going to talk about the October 14th Day of Sorrow. So until next time, I'm Scott. I'm an American in Bangkok. Chok di leo jerken mai. That's good luck, and see you later.